June 6, 1944 was a day when not just one city or army was at stake, but the fate of all of Europe. Imagine dawn over the beaches of Normandy, thousands of ships, from heavy cruisers to Dutch barges stretching along the coast, landing craft hovering in the air, and hundreds of kilometers of German fortifications on the shore. Success meant the beginning of the end of the Third Reich. Failure meant years of occupation in Western Europe and possibly a very different post-war world. Why was D-Day so risky? The scale, more than 150,000 people on the first day, thousands of ships and planes, required logistics on an epic scale. A miscalculation would have meant disaster. Secrecy and deception. The Allies had to deceive Rommel and the German command into expecting a landing at Pas de Calais rather than Normandy. This theatrical production was one of the keys to success. Resistance. The Atlantic Wall, designed by Rommel, turned the coast into an area where any landing without first neutralizing the fortifications would result in heavy losses. Politics and timing. Stalin demanded a second front. The Allies had to act while the Soviet Union was bearing the brunt of the burden in the East. Delays meant more casualties and geopolitical risks. Translated with DeepL.com, free version. After the defeats of 1940 to 1942, the Allies understood that the war in Europe could not be won by bombing and naval blockade alone. A large-scale land operation was needed. Thus was born the idea of invading across the English Channel, codenamed Overlord. Key date. Planning began in 1943, immediately after the Tehran Conference, where Stalin demanded that a second front be opened no later than 1944. Roosevelt and Churchill agreed, but agreement does not mean landing. Commander-in-Chief, General Dwight D. Eisenhower. Reason for selection, not just a talented officer, but the U.S.'s leading expert on coalition warfare. Skilled at working with the British, Canadians, the Navy, and the Air Force. Composition of forces. 3 countries, U.S., UK, Canada. Support, Poland, Norway, Australia, France. At the time of the landing, 156,000 soldiers, 11,000 aircraft, 6,900 ships and boats. This was the largest amphibious operation in human history. The main problem with the preparations: if the Germans find out the location and date, the landing is doomed. Therefore, in parallel with the real plans, Operation Fortuitous is created. A large-scale disinformation campaign with a fake army under Patton's command. Internal disputes. Where to land, Normandy or Pas de Calais? Are paratroopers needed the night before the landing? Is naval artillery preparation sufficient? And most importantly, will this entire structure be able to work as a single entity? Training and rehearsals went on for months. Soldiers stormed replicas of German fortifications, sappers tested explosive charges, pilots practiced precision strikes. And all this was classified as top secret. By June 1944, everything was ready. But the outcome still depended on one thing. The weather, and Eisenhower would have to wait, or take a risk. With the first rays of dawn on June 6, 1944, one of the most brutal phases of Operation Overlord began. At 6:30 a.m., American troops began landing on 2 sections of the coast, Utah and Omaha. On paper, the plan seemed flawless. In reality, everything turned out to be much more complicated. The weather played a role. Strong waves carried the landing craft off course. Many units landed far from their original target. At Utah, this accidentally saved hundreds of soldiers, as the defenses there were weaker. General Theodore Roosevelt Jr., already on the shore, said briefly, "We will start the war from here." Utah was taken faster than planned. But at Omaha, everything was different. Here, the Americans encountered the prepared defenses of the German 352nd Division. Machine guns and artillery literally mowed down the advancing ranks. In some rotations, 90% of the soldiers were killed before they even had time to run for cover. The beach was covered with bodies. The water ran red with blood. Radio communication was almost lost. The plan was broken, but small groups of Marines, 5 to 10 people each, began to act on their own. They did not wait for orders. Walking through the dead zone under fire, they blew up barricades, suppressed fortifications, and threw smoke grenades. It was precisely this, small groups of fighters making decisions on the spot, that turned the tide of battle. By noon. The Americans had secured the cliff. Omaha had not been taken, but for the first time it had been held. Everyone understood that if Omaha fell, the entire invasion would fail. After the terrible first hours at Omaha, American troops began to gradually turn the tide of battle. This was not a sudden miracle. It was a series of very specific actions taken on the brink of survival. By 1 p.m., small groups of infantry began climbing the steep slopes using shell craters and smoke screens. Engineering units blew up anti-tank hedgehogs and barbed wire, clearing narrow passages. At the same time, soldiers were already advancing deeper into the territory on Omaha Beach. There, the defenses were not as dense. By evening, the Americans had advanced 6 kilometers from the beach. However, the main threat remained. German reserves could counterattack at any moment. On Omaha, every meter was paid for with lives. By 3 p.m., the first points of connection between scattered units appeared. Communications were still down, but officers on the ground began to unite fighters from different companies, divisions, and even states. By evening, the Americans had managed to suppress key German firing points, machine gun nests on the heights. This was a turning point. From that moment on, the Germans could no longer completely control the beach. But the victory was not final. Tanks still could not land en masse. Most of them sank on approach. Allied artillery was inaccurate. Communication with gunners was chaotic. The Germans did not retreat, but regrouped. Nevertheless, by the end of June 6th, it was clear that the beachhead had been secured, and that meant only one thing: the operation would continue. By the evening of June 6th, the Allies had secured their position on the coast, but the real test was only just beginning. Realizing that the landing was not a diversionary tactic, the German command began to bring in reserves units from the 352nd and 716th Infantry Divisions, as well as elite units from the 21st Panzer Division, entered the fray. The first counterattacks were directed at American positions on Omaha Beach. The Germans struck quickly, in an organized manner, and with knowledge of the terrain. They used artillery from predetermined firing points. Where U.S. soldiers had just dug in, shells were already hitting their targets. The situation was different at Utah. American paratroopers from the 101st and 82nd Airborne Divisions held roads, intersections, and bridges, preventing German reinforcements from reaching the beaches. This played a key role. The Germans were losing time. Nevertheless, their counterattacks were a serious threat. There were only a few kilometers between the front line and the sea. If German tanks broke through, there would be nowhere to retreat. Allied artillery was still not working reliably. Particularly heavy fighting took place for the heights controlling access to the beaches. German crews tried to restore destroyed firing points or create new ones. The U.S. infantry called in naval artillery and aircraft, sometimes almost point-blank at their positions. Despite constant shelling, a lack of equipment, and exhaustion, the Americans held their ground. It did not look like a victory. It was a struggle at the limits of human endurance. The main objective was achieved. The bridgeheads were not destroyed. The front did not collapse. The landing continued. After the Allies secured the coast, the next task was to prevent the Germans from encircling the landing zone. On June 6th and 7th, American and British troops began moving deeper into Normandy, seeking to connect the separate beaches into a single front line. At Utah Beach, paratroopers from the 101st and 82nd Divisions took control of the towns of Saint-Mère-Église and Carentan, key road junctions. Without them, German tanks could have attacked the flanks and cut the American troops into pieces. At Omaha, soldiers from the 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions advanced meter by meter, sometimes at the cost of lives, toward the highway connecting the coast with the interior. The roads were mined. The fields were flooded. Every farm was fortified. The British had their own task, to advance towards the city of Caen. It was considered the key to Normandy. But the Germans defended Caen desperately, using the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitler Youth, manned by fanatically motivated fighters, many of whom were not even 19 years old. The expansion of the bridgehead took place under the following conditions: constant mortar and artillery fire, an offensive without complete air superiority, a shortage of tanks and fuel in the early days. But there was also a strong advantage. Every hour, new forces, equipment, and ammunition arrived in Normandy. Bridges, port structures, and piers were all built from scratch, literally before our eyes. By the end of the first week, the front had become unified. The Allies were already holding a line about 80 kilometers long. They were no longer just landed. They had gained a foothold, and now they were launching an offensive. The Germans had no intention of giving up Normandy without a fight. When it became clear that the Allies had secured the beaches, the Wehrmacht command threw its most mobile and combat-ready forces, its tank divisions, into the fray. The main striking force consisted of 21st Panzer Division, 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, 2nd SS Panzer Division Des Reich, 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler. Their task was not simply to push back the Allies, but to drive them back into the sea. In the early days, they tried to do just that. On the British sector, Panzer IV and Panther tanks counterattacked almost immediately. The fighting was fierce for every village, grove, and road. It was especially heavy for the town of Caen, which could not be taken quickly. The Americans faced another hell. The 17th SS Grenadier Division, supported by tank units, attacked near Carentan. The U.S. infantry had to repel the tank attack, often without anti-tank artillery, using light grenade bundles, bazookas, air support. Why were the Germans unable to defeat the Allies? There were several reasons. Allied intelligence intercepted orders decrypted in ultra. Air raids paralyzed German logistics. Tank units moved slowly, getting stuck in narrow French roads clogged with refugees and destroyed infrastructure. Hitler forbade Manstein and Rommel from retreating and maneuvering. Stand to the end. As a result, all major German counterattacks failed. They were unable to break through the bridgehead. They were unable to stop the supply of reinforcements. Normandy turned into a protracted war of attrition. And in such a war, the Allies had a huge advantage: resources. The city of Caen was the main target of British troops in the early hours of the operation, but they failed to capture it on June 6th. The Germans defended it fiercely and skillfully. This turned Caen into one of the most tense hubs of the entire Normandy operation. Why was Caen so important? It was a major road and rail junction. German reserve forces passed through it. Without Caen, the Allies could not advance deeper into France. The British were opposed by the best forces Germany had in the region, the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, manned by fanatical and well-armed SS youths. A few days later, they were joined by the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte. A series of operations began, each of which was intended to take Caen, Perche, an attempt to bypass the city from the flank, Epsom, a major offensive using Churchill tanks, Charnwood, hours of bombing and a frontal attack, Goodwood, the largest British tank offensive of the entire war. But each operation ran into the same problem. The Germans fought fanatically and did not count their losses. The Allies used carpet bombing, 150 to 200 millimeter caliber artillery, smoke screens, new tactics for tank and infantry cooperation. Caen was only taken 34 days after the landing, and even then the city was in ruins. Not a single house in the center remained intact. But this victory was significant. German tank divisions were exhausted. There was no longer a threat of a powerful flank attack. The Allies gained access to the plain, where tanks could be used to their full potential. The capture of Caen changed the course of the entire operation. Now it was time for a breakthrough. What would later be called the Battle of Normandy. By July 1944, the American Army was still confined to a narrow sector of Normandy. The terrain, hedgerows, bocage, dense bushes separated by stone walls, turned every kilometer into a fortified area. Advances were measured in hundreds of meters, and losses were measured in thousands of soldiers. Everything changed with the start of Operation Cobra, a major offensive developed by General Omar Bradley. The objective: to break through the German front south of St. Lo and reach open terrain, where American tanks would finally be able to maneuver. On July 24th, something began that the Germans did not expect on such a scale: carpet bombing. More than 1,500 bombers dropped tons of explosives on enemy positions. In one day, the entire forward defense was destroyed. But there were also tragic mistakes. Some of the bombs fell on their own troops, killing more than 100 American soldiers. Bradley was furious, but the offensive did not stop. On July 27th, the breakthrough took place. The German units did not hold the line. Many were crushed by artillery and air fire even before contact with the infantry. In addition, the Wehrmacht troops were exhausted by weeks of defense, a lack of fuel, and a shortage of fresh forces. American divisions began a rapid advance: 2nd Armored, 3rd Armored, 1st Infantry, 4th Infantry. The Sherman tanks advanced so quickly that headquarters could not keep up with updating the offensive map. The German defenses broke down, cracked, and crumbled. For the first time since the landing, the Americans were able to wage a maneuver war. By July 1944, the American Army was still confined to a narrow sector of Normandy. The terrain, hedgerows, bocage, dense bushes separated by stone walls, turned every kilometer into a fortified area. Advances were measured in hundreds of meters, and losses were measured in thousands of soldiers. Everything changed with the start of Operation Cobra, a major offensive developed by General Omar Bradley. The objective: to break through the German front south of St. Lo and reach open terrain, where American tanks would finally be able to maneuver. On July 24th, something began that the Germans did not expect on such a scale: carpet bombing. More than 1,500 bombers dropped tons of explosives on enemy positions. In one day, the entire forward defense was destroyed. But there were also tragic mistakes. Some of the bombs fell on their own troops, killing more than 100 American soldiers. Bradley was furious, but the offensive did not stop. On July 27th, the breakthrough took place. The German units did not hold the line. Many were crushed by artillery and air fire even before contact with the infantry. In addition, the Wehrmacht troops were exhausted by weeks of defense, a lack of fuel, and a shortage of fresh forces. American divisions began a rapid advance: 2nd Armored, 3rd Armored, 1st Infantry, 4th Infantry. The Sherman tanks advanced so quickly that headquarters could not keep up with updating the offensive map. The German defenses broke down, cracked, and crumbled. For the first time since the landing, the Americans were able to wage a maneuver war. The result of Operation Cobra: the front was broken through for 30 kilometers. German troops began a hasty retreat. The Allies were able to encircle large enemy forces. This led to the next stage, the Falaise Pocket, where the German army in western France effectively ceased to exist. After the breakthrough during Operation Cobra, German defenses in Normandy began to rapidly collapse. The Allies did not simply advance, they surrounded, fragmented, and destroyed German units that had been deprived of reserves and fuel by mid-August 8, 1944. The situation had become critical for the Wehrmacht. The remnants of the 7th Army and 5th Panzer Army found themselves in a semicircle around the town of Falaise. This led to the formation of the famous Falaise Pocket. The Allies launched continuous airstrikes. The Americans, British, Poles, and Canadians advanced on the ground. The Germans tried to break out, but it was too late. According to historians' estimates, 50,000 German soldiers were taken prisoner, 10 to 15,000 were killed. Hundreds of tanks, guns, and vehicles were destroyed or abandoned. After Falaise, there was no longer any organized German defense in the West. It was a strategic turning point. American divisions were now advancing eastward not by kilometers, but by tens of kilometers a day. Patton was advancing so quickly that headquarters sometimes couldn't keep up with fuel deliveries. On August 19th, an uprising began in Paris. By August 22nd, the Allies were already approaching. And on August 25th, the city was liberated. 80 days after landing in Normandy, the Allies broke through the Third Reich's defenses in the west, reached the Seine, liberated the French capital, turned the strategic initiative in their favor. But the war was far from over. Ahead lay the Ardennes, the Rhine, Berlin. However, it was Normandy that marked the beginning of the end. The battle proved that if forces, resources, and willpower are combined, even the strongest fortress will fall.